There is a growing sense across the world that something is shifting beneath the surface of reality. Not in headlines alone, not just in wars or technology or politics, but in the invisible architecture of human consciousness itself. Many believers feel it. Even skeptics feel it. A quiet tension in the air. A sense that history is accelerating toward a threshold. And for those who study biblical prophecy, especially the book of Revelation, that tension does not feel random. It feels patterned. For generations, Revelation has been treated either as metaphor, fear literature, or a distant future nightmare. Some interpret it symbolically. Others insist it predicts literal catastrophes. But what if both camps are missing something deeper? What if Revelation is not merely about destruction, but about separation? Not just about fire and judgment, but about filtration, a dividing line forming between states of awareness. When John describes seals breaking, trumpets sounding, beasts rising, and marks being placed, he was not writing in a vacuum. He was encoding spiritual realities in symbolic language. Apocalyptic literature was never meant to be tabloid prophecy. It was meant to reveal hidden structures of power, allegiance, and identity. The word apocalypse itself means unveiling, not annihilation, unveiling. And if Revelation is an unveiling, then the real question is not when will the world end, but what is being revealed right now. Consider how rapidly global systems have converged in the last decade. Financial systems integrating digitally, identity systems merging with biometric verification, artificial intelligence reshaping labor, communication, and perception. Information algorithms filtering what billions of people see and believe. For the first time in human history, a unified global infrastructure is technologically possible. Whether one interprets this through prophecy or geopolitics, the structural alignment is undeniable. Revelation speaks of a system in which buying and selling becomes conditional upon allegiance. It describes authority centralized under symbolic beasts. It describes deception powerful enough to mislead the majority for centuries. Critics argued such a system was logistically impossible. Today, that argument no longer holds. The infrastructure exists. The question is not capability. It is trajectory. But this is where many prophecy channels stop. They focus solely on fear, fire falling, plagues spreading, collapse inevitable. Yet fear alone cannot explain why Revelation repeatedly emphasizes endurance, wisdom, and discernment. If the message were only destruction, there would be no need for awareness. The repeated phrase, "He who has ears, let him hear," implies something subtle, something that can be missed. What if the unfolding signs are less about external catastrophe and more about internal alignment? Revelation describes two groups emerging, those marked by the beast and those sealed by God. Regardless of how one interprets the literal mechanism, the pattern is clear. Humanity divides according to allegiance and consciousness. One group conforms to a system of control. The other resists, often quietly, often invisibly. Now look at the current cultural climate. Polarization intensifying, narratives weaponized, truth contested, people pressured to declare identity publicly, digitally, socially, conformity incentivized, dissent penalized. The mechanics may not match medieval imagination, but the underlying dynamic feels strikingly similar. alignment with a system versus alignment with conviction. This is why some researchers and theologians suggest that 2026 is not about a single catastrophic event, but about convergence, multiple timelines intersecting, technological, geopolitical, spiritual, economic, creating a compression point, not necessarily an explosion, but a shift, a filter tightening. Historically, prophetic cycles often align with periods of structural transformation rather than instant annihilation, the fall of empires, the birth of new systems, the transition between ages. Revelation may describe not merely an ending, but a threshold between orders of reality. And thresholds are rarely comfortable. They destabilize before they clarify. There is another layer that many overlook. Revelation's beasts are not described merely as monsters. They are systems empowered by collective participation. Authority is granted to them. Influence spreads because it is received. Deception works because it resonates with desire. The text implies cooperation between system and subject. That means the prophetic dynamic is interactive. It depends on human choice. This shifts the conversation dramatically. If prophecy is interactive, then it is not fatalistic. It is conditional. The seals open, yes, but awareness determines alignment. The mark is placed, yes, but allegiance precedes inscription. The separation occurs, but consciousness initiates direction. So when people ask, is revelation happening now? Perhaps the more accurate question is, are the conditions described in Revelation structurally possible now? And the answer, for the first time in history, appears to be yes. We live in an era where digital identity can be centralized, where currency can be programmed, where speech can be algorithmically amplified or silenced, where virtual environments can simulate reality, where artificial intelligence can generate convincing falsehoods indistinguishable from truth. Revelation speaks repeatedly of deception so powerful it would mislead even the elect if possible. The technological capacity for mass deception now exists at unprecedented scale. But again, fear alone misses the deeper pattern. Revelation is not only a warning, it is a revelation of structure. It shows what happens when power centralizes without accountability. When allegiance shifts from divine truth to manufactured consensus, when convenience overrides conviction. And this brings us to the psychological dimension. The greatest control system is not physical enforcement. It is narrative dominance. If people voluntarily internalize a system's values, external coercion becomes unnecessary. Revelation's imagery of worship toward the beast suggests ideological absorption, not merely forced compliance. Look around. Ideologies today demand total identity alignment. Social systems reward conformity. Economic systems track participation. Data systems record behavior. While none of these alone equal apocalyptic fulfillment, the architecture resembles the blueprint described in symbolic form. This is why 2026 is discussed by some analysts not as a doomsday date, but as a milestone year within larger cycles, economic resets, technological implementation phases, geopolitical realignments. Whether one accepts those projections or not, the acceleration is measurable. Something is converging, and convergence creates clarity. Pressure reveals allegiance. Stress exposes foundation. Systems reveal their true nature when tested. Revelation may not be predicting chaos for chaos's sake. It may be describing what happens when human civilization reaches maximum centralization without corresponding moral evolution. So perhaps the unfolding signs are not merely wars or disasters, but structural shifts in control, identity, allegiance, and awareness. Perhaps the apocalypse is not the end of the world, but the end of illusion. If that is true, then the question is not whether prophecy is unfolding. The question is where we stand within it. Because Revelation does not present humanity as passive spectators, it presents us as participants, and participation implies choice. The real sign may not be fire in the sky. It may be a subtle pressure to conform, a growing normalization of total oversight, a quiet trade of autonomy for security. These are not cinematic catastrophes. They are incremental adjustments, and incremental adjustments are far more powerful than sudden collapse. This is only the beginning of the pattern. If incremental adjustments are more powerful than sudden collapse, then the unfolding of Revelation would not necessarily look like chaos erupting overnight. It would look like normalization. It would look like small compromises becoming standard practice. It would look like language, shifting subtly until ideas that once seemed extreme feel inevitable. This is how systems solidify, not through shock alone, but through repetition. When the book of Revelation describes the rise of the beast, it does not portray humanity as immediately terrified into submission. It describes admiration. Authority is given. Wonder spreads. Allegiance forms gradually. The text suggests fascination before domination. That detail matters. Because control that emerges through fascination is far more durable than control imposed through brute force. Consider how modern systems gain power. New technologies are introduced as conveniences. Digital wallets remove friction. Biometric identification promises security. Artificial intelligence optimizes productivity. Surveillance systems are framed as safety measures. Each innovation has a legitimate benefit. The issue is not the tool itself, but the cumulative architecture that forms when every tool integrates into a single network. Revelation speaks of a time when buying and selling becomes conditional. Historically, skeptics dismissed this as impossible. Ancient economies were too decentralized. Even modern economies were fragmented. But today, digital payment systems are increasingly centralized. Governments explore programmable currency. Private corporations control vast payment infrastructures. Access can be granted or revoked with a keystroke. Whether one interprets this prophetically or pragmatically, the capability exists. But capability alone does not equal fulfillment. What transforms capability into reality is collective acceptance. Systems require participation, and participation often begins with trust. Trust in institutions, trust in algorithms, trust in narratives that promise stability. This is where the psychological dimension intersects with prophecy. Revelation repeatedly emphasizes deception, not ignorance, but deception, the convincing presentation of something partial as something complete. Deception thrives when individuals outsource discernment, when critical thought is replaced with emotional reaction, when tribal loyalty overrides evidence. In the current era, Information spreads faster than verification. Narratives solidify before facts stabilize. Algorithms prioritize engagement, not accuracy. Outrage becomes currency. Fear becomes fuel. Under these conditions, mass perception can be shaped rapidly. Revelations. Warning about global deception no longer seems technologically implausible. It seems structurally aligned with modern communication systems. Yet revelation does not describe only deception. It describes endurance. Those who remain steadfast are characterized by patience and faith. This implies sustained pressure, not a single moment of crisis. Endurance is required only when pressure persists, and persistent pressure is exactly what slow systemic transformation creates. There is another subtle detail often overlooked. The beast in Revelation derives authority from a dragon. Symbolically, this suggests power that operates behind visible structures. Whether interpreted spiritually or metaphorically, the pattern suggests layered authority. Surface institutions influenced by deeper forces. Visible leadership shaped by unseen agendas. Even outside theological frameworks, history shows that power frequently concentrates behind formal titles. Influence networks often exceed official hierarchies. In our era, power operates across multinational corporations, financial institutions, technological platforms, intelligence agencies, and political alliances. Authority is rarely singular. It is distributed yet coordinated. This complexity mirrors the layered imagery of apocalyptic literature, not as proof of fulfillment, but as structural resonance. Another striking aspect of Revelation is its emphasis on marks, identifiers, that distinguish allegiance. Historically, this has been interpreted literally, symbolically, technologically, or spiritually. But regardless of interpretation, the concept of identity marking is central. Allegiance becomes visible. Participation becomes trackable. Today, digital identity systems are expanding globally. Biometric databases grow. Social credit frameworks are tested. Data profiles accumulate behavioral histories. The modern individual leaves a continuous digital footprint. Identity is no longer confined to physical presence. It exists within data architecture. While this alone does not constitute prophetic fulfillment, it reflects a world in which identity can be quantified and categorized at scale. If Revelation describes a time when allegiance determines access, then a society built upon programmable identity and digital permissions provides the infrastructure for such dynamics. Again, the key word is infrastructure. Prophecy may not predict invention. It may predict convergence. Convergence is a powerful concept. It occurs when independent developments align simultaneously. Technological innovation, economic instability, geopolitical tension, ideological polarization, environmental strain, each evolves separately. But when they intersect, transformation accelerates. Some analysts point toward the mid-2020s as a period of intensified convergence, not because of mysticism alone, but because of measurable economic cycles, debt structures, technological rollouts, and demographic transitions. The year 2026 appears in various speculative frameworks, not as a magical trigger, but as a checkpoint within broader timelines. Debt refinancing cliffs, artificial intelligence maturity curves, Central bank digital currency pilots moving toward implementation phases, election cycles, reshaping alliances. None of these individually guarantee apocalyptic fulfillment, but collectively, they indicate structural transition. Revelation's language is dramatic because transformation at scale is dramatic. When systems reorganize, those embedded within them experience instability. Jobs shift, currencies fluctuate, alliances fracture, information ecosystems mutate. The experience feels apocalyptic because identity structures are challenged. But what if the true apocalypse is epistemological? What if it is about the collapse of trusted narratives, when institutions lose credibility, when truth becomes fragmented, when consensus fractures, society enters cognitive instability? Revelation describes confusion, false prophets, and persuasive signs. In a world saturated with synthetic media and AI-generated content, discerning authenticity becomes increasingly complex. The deeper question then becomes, how does one remain anchored? Revelation emphasizes discernment and spiritual awareness. This suggests that the battleground is not merely physical, but perceptual. Control over perception precedes control over behavior. If perception can be shaped, allegiance can be redirected. Notice how modern systems gamify attention. Notifications trigger dopamine responses. Feeds are curated to reinforce bias. Emotional intensity is rewarded algorithmically over time. Individuals may not realize how their worldview is being shaped. Revelation's imagery of widespread deception may not require supernatural spectacle. It may unfold through psychological engineering. Yet amid these concerns, Revelation repeatedly offers reassurance to those who remain steadfast. The narrative is not hopeless. It is clarifying. The unveiling reveals both danger and deliverance. The separation is not arbitrary. It reflects internal orientation. Those who align with truth endure. Those who align with control. Systems may gain temporary stability, but risk long-term compromise. The concept of separation deserves careful attention. Many interpret it as physical division, but it can also represent divergence in worldview. Two populations occupying the same physical space, yet perceiving reality through incompatible lenses. One trusting centralized authority implicitly, the other questioning systemic consolidation. One valuing convenience above autonomy, the other prioritizing conscience above comfort. This divergence is already visible globally. Cultural rifts widen. Debates intensify. Trust erodes. Information bubbles solidify. In many regions, citizens interpret the same events through entirely different frameworks. Such polarization creates fertile ground for consolidation under promises of unity and order. Revelation warns of a period when peace appears temporarily under centralized authority. Stability offered at the cost of allegiance. The temptation is understandable. In times of uncertainty, people crave clarity. They crave leadership that promises resolution. But centralized resolution often requires centralized control. The subtlety of the prophetic warning lies here. The danger may not arrive disguised as chaos. It may arrive disguised as rescue. If that is the case, then vigilance requires more than fear of catastrophe. It requires critical awareness of systems presented as solutions. It requires examination of trade-offs embedded within convenience. It requires understanding that structural shifts rarely announce their ultimate implications. The unfolding may already be underway not as dramatic spectacle, but as administrative reform, digital integration, policy standardization, and narrative synchronization. Each step appears rational in isolation. Together, they construct a new architecture of governance. And architecture shapes behavior. Revelation's beasts are not random creatures. They symbolize structured authority, authority that influences commerce, culture, and consciousness simultaneously. When economic systems, communication platforms, and governance frameworks converge under unified protocols, influence becomes comprehensive. We are not yet at the climax described in apocalyptic imagery, but we are perhaps closer than any previous generation to possessing the infrastructure that would make such imagery conceivable. This does not demand panic. It demands awareness, because awareness precedes choice, and choice determines alignment. Awareness alone, however, is not enough. History shows that many societies recognize shifts only after they are deeply embedded within them. The challenge is not merely seeing change, but interpreting its direction correctly. Revelation does not simply warn that systems will rise. It emphasizes that those systems will appear persuasive, even righteous in presentation. This is what makes discernment essential. The most transformative periods in history rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They frame themselves as necessary. If we examine previous global turning points, we notice a consistent pattern. Crisis accelerates consolidation. Economic collapse leads to centralized financial authority. War leads to expanded surveillance powers. Pandemics lead to digital health infrastructure. Environmental instability leads to coordinated regulatory frameworks. Each crisis justifies structural reinforcement. Individually, these responses can be rational. Collectively, they can produce unprecedented centralization. Revelation's imagery of global authority once seemed implausible, because ancient civilizations lacked the communication speed and logistical coordination required. Empires rose and fell regionally, but truly synchronized global governance was beyond reach. Today, communication is instantaneous. Financial markets are interconnected. Policy decisions ripple globally within minutes. A coordinated framework across continents is no longer theoretical. It is operationally feasible. But perhaps the most profound shift is not technological, but anthropological. Human identity itself is evolving in digital space. For the first time, billions maintain parallel existences online. Reputation, validation, social standing, and even economic opportunity are mediated by digital presence. This creates a subtle psychological dependency. When identity becomes tied to system participation, the cost of dissent increases. Revelation's warning about marks and allegiance may symbolize more than a physical inscription. It may describe the integration of identity within a system that defines access, belonging, and legitimacy. Once identity is system-bound, resistance feels existentially threatening. Losing access becomes equivalent to losing self. This is where the spiritual dimension deepens. Revelation does not merely describe external compliance. It describes worship. Worship implies devotion, trust, and emotional allegiance. In modern terms, Worship can manifest as ideological loyalty so strong that critique feels immoral. When systems become sacred in perception, they transcend accountability. Observe contemporary discourse, institutions, corporations, political movements. Even technological platforms often cultivate brand identities that resemble belief systems. Critics are marginalized, not merely for disagreement, but for perceived betrayal. Loyalty is rewarded, skepticism is penalized. This dynamic reflects a subtle sacralization of systems. If Revelation portrays a period when allegiance to a global authority becomes a defining line, then understanding how allegiance forms psychologically is crucial. Allegiance rarely emerges from coercion alone. It grows from perceived necessity, reinforced by fear of exclusion. Consider how social pressure operates in digital culture. Narratives trend rapidly. Opinions are amplified. Silence can be interpreted as opposition. Over time, conformity feels safer than dissent. This gradual pressure can reshape collective values without explicit mandates. It is soft alignment, not overt force. Yet Revelation speaks of those who refuse alignment despite consequence. This suggests an inner conviction that transcends external incentive. Endurance implies sacrifice. The prophetic narrative anticipates tension between comfort and conscience. Now examine the economic dimension. Financial systems worldwide are navigating unprecedented debt levels, inflationary pressures, and currency volatility. Discussions about central bank digital currencies have moved from theoretical white papers to pilot programs. A programmable currency introduces possibilities both beneficial and restrictive. It can streamline transactions and reduce fraud. It can also enforce conditional spending parameters. The ethical framework guiding such technology determines its impact. When Revelation describes buying and selling tied to allegiance, many imagine a sudden authoritarian decree. But systemic shifts often occur gradually. Policy evolves through phases. Public acceptance increases through incremental implementation. A digital infrastructure, introduced for efficiency, can later be repurposed under crisis conditions. This does not mean every innovation is inherently malicious. It means that architecture matters. Tools reflect the intentions of those who govern them. Revelation's beasts are empowered not merely by existence, but by authority granted. Authority is relational. It is legitimized through compliance. There is also a geopolitical layer to consider. The international order is in transition. Alliances are shifting. Economic blocs are redefining trade relationships. Energy dependencies are recalibrating. Military technologies are advancing rapidly. Periods of multipolar tension often precede restructuring. Revelation describes conflict preceding consolidation. Historically, power vacuums invite reorganization. The acceleration we witness today may represent not the climax, but the preparation stage. Infrastructure consolidates, narratives polarize, identities solidify. When tension peaks, a unifying frame, work becomes attractive. Unity promises relief, but unity without accountability risks dominance. Another striking element in Revelation is the portrayal of false prophets, performing persuasive signs. In ancient times, signs implied supernatural phenomena. In modern context, signs may manifest through technological spectacle. Artificial intelligence can generate hyperrealistic media. Deepfakes blur authenticity. Synthetic narratives can influence millions. Within hours, when perception can be engineered convincingly, the potential for mass persuasion expands dramatically. Discernment in such an environment requires more than surface analysis. It requires foundational principles anchored beyond fluctuating information streams. Revelation repeatedly emphasizes wisdom. Wisdom implies the ability to interpret patterns beyond immediate appearance. If we consider the symbolic language of beasts rising from sea and earth, we might interpret them as emergent systems from chaos and stability, respectively. The sea often symbolizes disorder. The earth suggests established order. Systems can emerge from crisis or from bureaucracy. Both can centralize power. The convergence of digital infrastructure, economic stress, geopolitical tension, and psychological polarization creates a unique historical moment. For the first time, humanity possesses the technological means for global integration and the social fragmentation that makes centralized solutions appealing. This paradox is critical. Fragmentation drives desire for unity. Instability drives demand for order. Revelation's narrative anticipates both fragmentation and consolidation. It is not chaos alone. It is chaos followed by structured authority. Yet amid all this, there remains a deeper layer. Revelation ultimately frames events within a cosmic narrative of justice and restoration. The warnings are severe, but the trajectory culminates in renewal. The unveiling exposes corruption before transformation. This suggests that the purpose of revelation is not despair, but preparation. Preparation for what? For clarity, for alignment, for conscious choice in an era where unconscious conformity is easier. When analysts speak of 2026 as a convergence year, they often reference economic refinancing cycles, technological implementation milestones, and geopolitical realignment windows. Whether these projections materialize precisely as predicted is secondary. What matters is recognizing that we are within a compression period. Systems are tightening. Decisions are accelerating. Infrastructure is integrating. Compression reveals fault lines. Under pressure, weak structures fracture. Strong foundations hold. Revelation may describe what happens when global systems undergo maximum stress. The question then becomes deeply personal. In a world of increasing integration, where does one anchor identity? In digital validation, in institutional trust, in ideological tribe, or in transcendent conviction? Revelation's enduring message is not simply be afraid, but remain faithful. Faithfulness implies consistency amid pressure. It implies refusal to surrender, core values for temporary stability. As we move further into this decade, the pace of change will likely intensify. Artificial intelligence will evolve. Digital currencies may expand. Surveillance technologies may refine. Political alliances may shift unpredictably. Each development will present trade-offs. The prophetic lens does not demand paranoia. It demands awareness of trade-offs. Because every system, no matter how efficient, carries embedded values. And when values conflict with conscience, alignment becomes a choice. We stand not necessarily at the end of history, but at a hinge point. A moment where infrastructure aligns with ancient warnings in unprecedented ways. Whether this leads to fulfillment of apocalyptic imagery or merely reflects recurring historical cycles remains to be seen. But the structural parallels are closer than ever before, and structural parallels invite examination. If structural parallels invite examination, then we must go deeper than headlines and surface-level interpretations. The Book of Revelation is not merely a sequence of catastrophic imagery. It is a layered symbolic narrative. To understand whether its patterns are emerging, we must look beyond literalism and explore the architecture beneath the symbols. Because prophecy, at its core, is less about predicting dates and more about revealing trajectories. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Revelation is the sequence of seals, trumpets, and bowls. Many interpret them as linear disasters stacked chronologically. Yet apocalyptic literature often functions cyclically rather than sequentially. The same reality is described from different angles, intensifying in clarity rather than unfolding like a simple timeline. If this is true, then what we may be witnessing today is not the beginning of events, but the magnification of patterns that have always existed, now amplified by global connectivity. The first seals describe conquest, war, scarcity, and death. Historically, these forces have never disappeared. They recur in cycles. However, what distinguishes our era is scale and synchronization. Conflict in one region now impacts global markets instantly. Food shortages ripple through international supply chains. Financial instability in one nation can trigger worldwide economic tremors. The horsemen, symbolically speaking, now ride across a digitally unified planet. But Revelation does not stop at describing external turmoil. It shifts toward internal allegiance. The critical dividing line is not who survives physically, but who remains aligned spiritually. This reframes the narrative entirely. If prophecy centers on allegiance, then technological and political developments are context, not climax. Consider the phrase often repeated in Revelation, "Here is wisdom." It appears at crucial interpretive moments, particularly when discussing the number associated with the beast. The text invites calculation. It invites discernment. It does not demand blind fear. This implies that the prophetic narrative expects readers to analyze systems intelligently. Throughout history, interpreters have attempted to assign the number 666 to specific leaders or regimes. Most of these identifications proved temporary. Empires fell, figures passed away. The pattern, however, persisted. This suggests that the beast may represent not merely an individual, but a recurring archetype, centralized power demanding ideological submission. If that archetype is correct, then the prophetic warning becomes less about identifying a single villain, and more about recognizing systemic consolidation that overrides conscience. Centralized systems can emerge under various political labels. They can arise in democratic frameworks, authoritarian states, or corporate networks. The common denominator is not ideology, but control. Control becomes most efficient when it is invisible. When participation feels voluntary, when surveillance feels protective, when compliance feels beneficial. Revelation's imagery of global admiration toward the beast hints at this paradox. Authority is not initially resisted. It is celebrated. In the modern world, celebration of systems often manifests through convenience. The faster the transaction, the smoother the interface, the more integrated the service, the more trust users place in it. Convenience builds dependency. Dependency builds loyalty. Loyalty discourages scrutiny. Yet the prophetic narrative emphasizes a remnant that resists absorption, not violently, but steadfastly. This resistance is rooted in conviction, not reaction. It is anchored in values that transcend system incentives. As we analyze present developments, it becomes clear that technological integration is accelerating at exponential rates. Artificial intelligence is not merely automating tasks. It is shaping decision-making processes. Predictive algorithms influence financial markets, hiring practices, criminal justice assessments, and social media feeds. Decisions once made by humans are increasingly delegated to machine learning systems trained on vast datasets. This introduces a subtle but profound shift. When decision-making becomes algorithmic, accountability becomes opaque. Systems operate according to logic embedded by programmers and data patterns that may be biased or incomplete. Revelations' warnings about deception resonate in such environments not because algorithms are inherently malevolent, but because opacity allows influence without transparency. Furthermore, the integration of artificial intelligence with biometric data and financial infrastructure raises questions about autonomy, if identity verification, economic access, and behavioral tracking converge within unified platforms. The potential for conditional participation expands dramatically. Participation in society may become increasingly contingent upon compliance with evolving standards. The prophetic imagery of a mark, whether interpreted literally or symbolically, emphasizes visible alignment. In digital culture, visible alignment already occurs through public declarations, online profiles, and data footprints. Social approval metrics quantify belonging. Behavioral histories remain archived indefinitely. The digital self becomes inseparable from opportunity. While none of this alone fulfills apocalyptic prophecy definitively, it reflects a world in which the mechanisms described symbolically are technologically feasible. That feasibility alters the interpretive landscape. For centuries, critics dismissed Revelation as impossible fantasy. Today, its structural concepts align with emerging realities. Yet caution is essential. Historical cycles have repeatedly generated apocalyptic expectations that did not culminate in ultimate fulfillment. Wars, plagues, economic collapses, and technological revolutions have all been interpreted as final signs. The difference now lies not in intensity of crisis, but in global synchronization and digital integration. Another layer to examine is the economic restructuring underway worldwide. Global debt levels have reached historic highs. Central banks navigate inflationary pressures while attempting to maintain stability. Discussions of currency digitization reflect efforts to modernize financial systems. In such transitions, policy frameworks can shift rapidly. Monetary policy, once debated in parliaments, may be executed through programmable code. Revelation's association between allegiance and commerce may reflect the intertwining of economic access with ideological conformity. When financial participation depends upon digital identity systems, and digital identity systems embed behavioral metrics, economic freedom can become conditional. This does not require dystopian exaggeration. It requires acknowledgement that infrastructure shapes possibility. Tools that enable efficiency can also enable restriction. The moral direction of technology depends on governance and public vigilance. Geopolitically, we observe increasing tension between global blocs, trade disputes, technological competition, energy realignment, and military posturing contribute to instability. Revelation describes wars and rumors of wars as precursors to consolidation. Historically, large-scale conflicts have catalyzed international institutions designed to prevent recurrence. Such institutions often centralize authority in pursuit of stability. Stability is desirable. Order reduces suffering. But order without accountability risks oppression. Revelation's narrative suggests that ultimate authority should not rest in fallible human systems alone. When systems claim moral supremacy without transparency, they drift toward the archetype described symbolically as beastly. There is also a spiritual dimension that transcends politics and technology. Revelation ultimately frames the conflict as one of worship and allegiance at the heart level. Systems can shape behavior, but belief shapes identity. If identity becomes anchored in transient structures, it becomes vulnerable to manipulation. If identity remains anchored in transcendent truth, it becomes resilient. This is perhaps the deepest message embedded in apocalyptic literature. Not prediction of catastrophe, but preservation of conscience amid transformation. The unveiling exposes systems so that individuals can choose alignment consciously rather than unconsciously. As we approach the mid-2020s, analysts across economic, technological, and geopolitical domains acknowledge acceleration. Whether 2026 represents a decisive pivot or merely a visible milestone remains uncertain. But acceleration itself is undeniable. Acceleration compresses decision-making. It reduces reflection time. It pressures institutions and individuals to adapt rapidly under compression. Shortcuts become tempting. Expediency can override principle. Revelation's call to endurance, therefore, becomes increasingly relevant. Endurance resists shortcuts that compromise core values. It maintains clarity when narratives intensify. It refuses to equate convenience with virtue. The unveiling may not manifest as fire descending from the sky. It may manifest as clarity emerging from confusion, as systems reveal their underlying values, as trade-offs become visible, as allegiances solidify. In such moments, neutrality becomes difficult. Silence can be interpreted as consent. Participation implies endorsement. Withdrawal carries cost. The prophetic narrative anticipates tension precisely at this intersection. The world may not end in a single dramatic explosion. It may transform through layered integration, converging pressures, and escalating alignment demands. And if that transformation reflects patterns long described symbolically, then we are not witnessing randomness. We are witnessing trajectory. If we are witnessing trajectory rather than randomness, then the next question is unavoidable. Trajectory toward what? Prophecy does not merely describe systems consolidating. It describes culmination, a moment when pressures that have been building beneath the surface become undeniable. But culmination in Revelation is not simply political or technological. It is spiritual. It is the exposure of what humanity ultimately trusts. Throughout the text, There is a recurring contrast between two cities, Babylon and the New Jerusalem. Babylon represents wealth, influence, commerce, cultural dominance, and seductive power. It is prosperous, admired, interconnected. Yet it is also described as corrupt. Intoxicated with its own excess, the New Jerusalem, in contrast, symbolizes restored order grounded in divine authority rather than human ambition. This contrast is not just future imagery, it is an archetype. Every era constructs its own version of Babylon, a system of commerce, culture, and centralized influence that appears invincible. Historically, such systems eventually collapse under the weight of internal contradiction. Revelation dramatizes this collapse not merely as economic failure, but as moral exposure. In our time, global markets are deeply intertwined. Corporations wield influence rivaling nation-states. Cultural narratives spread instantly across continents. Entertainment, politics, finance, and technology interlock. This interconnection brings unprecedented opportunity, but it also concentrates vulnerability. When everything connects, instability spreads quickly. Revelation's depiction of Babylon's fall emphasizes how suddenly perceived permanence can dissolve. Merchants weep, leaders panic. The system that seemed unshakable collapses in a single hour. Symbolically, this suggests fragility beneath apparent strength. Complex systems are powerful, but complexity can amplify cascading failure. Modern infrastructure depends on electricity grids, internet connectivity, satellite networks, supply chains, and algorithmic coordination. Disruption in one domain reverberates through others. Financial markets operate on high-speed trading systems dependent on real-time data, logistics. Networks rely on predictive analytics. Governments depend on digital communication. This integration increases efficiency while reducing redundancy. The prophetic warning embedded within Babylon's fall may not predict a specific mechanism, but it highlights a principle. Systems built primarily on self-exaltation rather than sustainable ethics become unstable. When profit overrides prudence, when influence supersedes accountability, collapse becomes not a question of if, but when. Yet Revelation's narrative does not present collapse as arbitrary. It frames it as consequence. Actions produce outcomes. Systems reap what they sow. This moral dimension distinguishes apocalyptic literature from mere disaster prediction. It asserts that justice operates beyond immediate perception. Consider how contemporary societies navigate ethical dilemmas surrounding technology. Artificial intelligence can optimize productivity, but it can also displace labor. Surveillance can enhance security, but it can erode privacy. Genetic engineering can cure disease, but it raises profound moral questions. Each advancement carries dual potential. The direction chosen reflects underlying values. Revelation suggests that when power concentrates without corresponding moral accountability, corruption follows, not necessarily through overt tyranny at first, but through incremental compromise. Decisions justified for efficiency gradually erode foundational principles. Over time, ethical drift becomes normalized. There is also an economic undercurrent to this trajectory. Global inequality continues to widen. Wealth concentration intensifies. While markets expand, many feel economically precarious. Revelation's portrayal of merchants mourning Babylon's fall hints at economic structures deeply embedded in moral compromise. Prosperity achieved without justice breeds instability. In times of inequality and uncertainty, populations become more receptive to centralized promises of reform. Strong leadership emerges, offering decisive solutions. Historically, such moments have birthed both beneficial reforms and authoritarian regimes. The difference lies in accountability mechanisms and public vigilance. Another dimension often overlooked is environmental strain, climate variability, resource depletion, and ecological imbalance introduce additional pressure. Revelation describes ecological disturbances symbolically: waters turning bitter, vegetation burning, seas disrupted. While ancient imagery cannot be mapped directly onto modern environmental science, the concept of systemic strain remains relevant. When environmental, economic, technological, and geopolitical pressures intersect, societies enter threshold states. Threshold states are unstable by nature. Small triggers can produce disproportionate effects. Revelation's dramatic imagery may represent the psychological experience of crossing such thresholds. But beyond structural analysis lies the deeper spiritual confrontation. Revelation ultimately portrays a choice between allegiance to a system promising security and allegiance to transcendent truth requiring endurance. The tension intensifies as pressure increases. In practical terms, this could manifest as moments when individuals must decide whether to compromise deeply held convictions for access or advancement. As digital infrastructures become more integrated with economic participation, the space for dissent may narrow. The prophetic narrative anticipates precisely such narrowing. Yet fear is not the intended response. The text consistently pairs warning with assurance. Those who remain aligned with truth are not abandoned. The climax culminates not in perpetual chaos, but in restoration. This is critical because apocalyptic rhetoric can easily devolve into fatalism. Fatalism breeds passivity. Revelation, however, encourages active faithfulness. It calls for vigilance, wisdom, and resilience. As discussions about mid-decade convergence intensify, particularly around 2026, it is important to separate speculation from structure. Specific dates have repeatedly proven unreliable in prophetic history, but structural convergence is observable. Debt cycles align, technological adoption curves mature, political transitions accumulate, social polarization deepens. When multiple cycles converge, acceleration becomes visible. Whether that acceleration culminates in dramatic upheaval or gradual transformation remains uncertain, but the conditions for rapid change are present. Another factor shaping trajectory is demographic transition. Many developed nations face aging populations, shifting labor markets, and migration pressures. Such shifts influence economic policy, social cohesion, and political stability. Rapid demographic change can amplify polarization, increasing desire for decisive governance. In Revelation's narrative, global authority emerges during a period of widespread instability. Instability creates opportunity for consolidation. Consolidation promises relief. Relief often requires concession. The deeper spiritual issue, then, is not technological capability, but trust. What do societies trust to secure their future? Markets, governments, Algorithms, charismatic leaders, or transcendent principles that remain stable beyond institutional flux. Trust shapes allegiance. Allegiance shapes action. Action shapes outcome. If trajectory is indeed bending toward greater integration and centralization, the key variable will be conscience. Systems may evolve rapidly, but individuals still choose how deeply to integrate their identity within them. Revelation's portrayal of a faithful remnant implies that even under intense systemic pressure, alternative alignment remains possible. This is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because pressure will intensify. Hopeful because autonomy of belief persists. As we move further into this decade, watch not only headlines, but incentives. Watch which behaviors are rewarded. Watch which narratives are amplified. Watch which forms of dissent are tolerated and which are penalized. These signals reveal system values more clearly than official statements. Trajectory is shaped by incentives. If incentives increasingly favor conformity over conscience, the prophetic parallels deepen. If accountability and transparency expand alongside integration, the parallels weaken. Outcomes remain contingent. We are not passive observers of prophecy. We are participants in history. Structural forces are real, but so is human agency. The coming years may not unfold exactly as apocalyptic imagery suggests. Symbolism leaves room for interpretation, but the convergence of infrastructure, pressure, and identity politics creates a landscape remarkably resonant with ancient warnings. Whether 2026 becomes a visible inflection point or simply another step in acceleration, the deeper issue remains unchanged: alignment. And alignment is chosen long before crisis peaks. If alignment is chosen before the peak, then preparation must begin before the pressure becomes visible. This is where most people misunderstand prophetic discourse. They assume preparation means stockpiling resources, predicting dates, or decoding hidden timelines. But Revelation places far greater emphasis on internal stability than external survival strategy. When instability rises, external control becomes attractive. Humans are wired to seek order during uncertainty. Throughout history, crises have consistently expanded centralized authority. War increases executive power. Economic collapse expands regulatory frameworks. Pandemics justify emergency measures. Each step is often rational in isolation. The pattern emerges only in retrospect. Revelation anticipates this psychological dynamic. It describes a world fatigued by chaos, ready to accept a unifying solution. Not necessarily because populations are evil, but because they are exhausted. Exhaustion lowers resistance. Fear accelerates compliance. Look closely at modern information systems. News cycles operate at high velocity. Social media amplifies outrage. Algorithms prioritize emotionally charged content. Constant stimulation fragments attention and heightens anxiety. A population living in perpetual reaction becomes easier to guide. This is not conspiracy. It is behavioral economics and cognitive science. When cognitive load increases, people default to simplified narratives and authoritative guidance. Complex societies generate complex stress. Stress increases demand for strong coordination. Now consider digital identity systems. Around the world, governments and corporations are exploring unified identification frameworks for financial access, healthcare, and civic participation. These systems promise efficiency and fraud reduction. They also consolidate data into centralized architectures. The architecture itself is neutral. Its ethical implementation determines impact. Revelation's warning is not about technology inherently. It is about integration without conscience. When access to participation becomes contingent on ideological conformity, the line between governance and coercion blurs. We are not there fully, but early frameworks are forming. Central bank digital currencies are being researched and piloted in multiple regions. Biometric authentication is expanding. Artificial intelligence monitors transactions for irregularities. Each advancement increases oversight capacity. Oversight can protect. It can also control. The difference lies in transparency, checks and balances, and cultural values. Revelation's symbolic mark may represent not merely a physical sign, but allegiance embedded into economic participation. When buying and selling are conditioned upon declared loyalty, autonomy narrows. If such systems mature in the latter half of this decade, public perception will determine acceptance. Perception is shaped long before implementation. Gradual normalization reduces resistance. People rarely object to systems that emerge incrementally. This is why trajectory matters more than dates. Another critical dimension is spiritual literacy. In times of acceleration, discernment becomes rare. Propaganda thrives in polarized climates. Narratives fragment into competing realities. Revelation emphasizes wisdom, the capacity to perceive beyond surface presentation. Wisdom requires stillness. Stillness is increasingly scarce. Modern attention economies monetize distraction. The more time individuals spend reacting, the less time they spend reflecting. Without reflection, alignment drifts unconsciously. People adapt to systems without realizing how deeply they have internalized them. Preparation, then, is not panic. It is clarity. Clarity about values. Clarity about non-negotiables. Clarity about what one would refuse even if refusal carried cost. History shows that moments of consolidation test these boundaries. Some comply for security. Some resist quietly. Some withdraw. Most adjust gradually. Revelation portrays endurance as the defining characteristic of those who remain aligned with truth. Endurance implies prolonged pressure, not momentary shock. This suggests that if significant consolidation emerges, it may unfold over years rather than weeks. There is also the geopolitical dimension. Shifts in global power balances often precede systemic restructuring. Rising powers challenge established orders. Economic alliances realign. Military deterrence strategies evolve. Each adjustment increases tension. When tension peaks, diplomatic miscalculation becomes more likely. Revelation's imagery of widespread conflict may symbolize not constant warfare, but a period where localized conflicts ripple through global networks. Add to this the technological wild card. Artificial intelligence evolving toward autonomous decision systems. If decision-making increasingly shifts from human deliberation to algorithmic optimization, accountability becomes abstract. Who is responsible when outcomes are harmful? The programmer, the institution, the model. Distributed responsibility can obscure moral clarity. Revelation repeatedly contrasts human authority claiming divine legitimacy. In modern terms, this could manifest as systems presented as inevitable, objective, or scientifically unchallengeable. When policy is framed as purely technical rather than moral, dissent appears irrational. But many decisions are value-laden, even when couched in data. The spiritual undercurrent of Revelation warns against surrendering moral agency to systems that promise utopia. Every utopian promise in history has demanded trade-offs. The greater the promise, the deeper the concession required. Yet this is not a call to reject innovation. Technology is a tool. Integration can enhance life. The question is governance and conscience. As 2026 approaches, if acceleration continues, expect increasing rhetoric around unity, sustainability, safety, and efficiency. These are legitimate goals. The discernment lies in examining implementation mechanisms. Do policies preserve freedom of conscience? Do systems allow opt-out pathways? Is dissent protected or penalized? Are decision processes transparent or opaque? These criteria reveal trajectory. At a personal level, preparation includes strengthening local resilience, strong community. Networks reduce dependence on centralized systems. Diverse skill sets increase adaptability. Financial literacy enhances stability. Emotional regulation protects against manipulation. Revelation's faithful are not portrayed as isolated mystics. They are communities sustaining one another through pressure. Another overlooked factor is narrative control. In high-pressure eras, language shifts. Certain words become stigmatized. Others become mandatory. Observing linguistic patterns provides insight into emerging power structures. Control over language precedes control over action. The mid-2020s also represent generational transition. Younger generations, raised fully in digital ecosystems, may perceive surveillance and data integration differently than older ones. Norms shift quickly when cultural baselines change. If a unified digital economic infrastructure solidifies within the next few years, it will likely be accepted as natural by many. Only those who consciously examine its implications will question deeper trade-offs. Revelation's apocalyptic intensity should not lead to hysteria. It should cultivate awareness. Awareness reduces susceptibility to fear-based manipulation. If global systems stabilize and reforms enhance liberty, then the trajectory will diverge from the darker interpretations. But if crises accumulate and consolidation accelerates with diminishing accountability, parallels strengthen. The coming phase is less about predicting catastrophe and more about recognizing inflection points. Inflection points are subtle before they are obvious. Alignment is quiet before it is tested publicly. And preparation is internal before it becomes visible externally. The real question is not whether 2026 fulfills prophecy in dramatic fashion. The real question is whether individuals and communities cultivate clarity before systems demand declaration. Because when declaration becomes necessary, hesitation becomes costly. There is a moment in every major transition of history when the atmosphere changes. Before the headlines do, people feel it before they can articulate it. Conversations shift. Humor grows sharper or darker. Trust thins. Institutions speak more frequently about stability. Markets react more. sensitively to rumor. It is subtle at first, like pressure building before a storm. Revelation captures this sensation symbolically through escalating sequences, seals, trumpets, bowls, each intensifying the previous disturbance, whether taken literally or metaphorically. The structure itself communicates acceleration, not chaos from nowhere, but waves building upon waves. Acceleration is the defining characteristic of our era. Technological adoption curves that once took decades now unfold in years. Artificial intelligence models evolve within months. Financial markets react within milliseconds. Cultural narratives can rise and collapse in a single news cycle. This compression of time changes psychology. When events move quickly, emotional regulation lags behind. Acceleration without grounding produces volatility. Historically, societies that experienced rapid technological shifts without parallel ethical frameworks faced instability. The Industrial Revolution transformed labor and wealth distribution before labor protections matured. The nuclear age introduced annihilation capacity before diplomatic safeguards stabilized. Deterrence. Today, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, and digital finance are advancing simultaneously. Unlike past eras where transformations were sector-specific, this wave is multi-domain. That convergence multiplies unpredictability. Revelation's imagery of cascading disruption may symbolize precisely this multi-layered acceleration, economic shock, intertwined with ecological strain, intertwined with political realignment, intertwined with spiritual crisis. Now consider psychological thresholds. When populations perceive that the old order no longer functions, openness to radical restructuring increases. It does not require universal collapse. It requires perceived instability. If 2026 or the surrounding years mark a convergence of debt pressures, geopolitical tension, technological integration, and environmental stress, perception may shift decisively. Even if daily life continues outwardly, collective confidence could fracture. Confidence is the invisible currency of civilization. Banking systems run on trust. Fiat currencies operate on belief. Democratic institutions function on legitimacy. Remove confidence, and structures wobble. Revelation's portrayal of sudden economic downfall speaks to confidence collapse more than physical annihilation. When merchants mourn Babylon, they are mourning lost stability, lost predictability. Modern global debt levels are historically high. Sovereign debt burdens constrain fiscal flexibility. If growth slows while obligations remain, stress compounds. Central banks attempt balancing acts between inflation control and economic stimulation. Each decision carries trade-offs. If monetary systems undergo significant transformation, whether through digital currencies or restructuring of reserve standards, the transition could feel apocalyptic to those unprepared, not because the world ends, but because the familiar world dissolves. But acceleration is not solely structural. It is spiritual. Revelation frames the climax not merely as economic or political crisis, but as revelation of allegiance. The Greek word apocalypsis means unveiling. Something hidden becomes visible. What might be unveiled in a hyper-connected era? Hidden corruption becomes harder to conceal in transparent networks. Yet misinformation also spreads faster. Hidden motives surface through leaks and digital trails, yet deepfakes blur authenticity. Truth becomes contested territory. In such an environment, discernment is both more necessary and more difficult. The text repeatedly emphasizes watchfulness, not obsession, not paranoia. Watchfulness implies calm alertness, the capacity to observe patterns without being consumed by them. If coming years intensify polarization, media ecosystems may fracture further. Competing narratives may describe the same event in incompatible terms. Revelation's imagery of deception resonates here, not as supernatural illusion alone, but as epistemological fragmentation. When shared reality erodes, unity becomes difficult, and in fractured societies, calls for centralized narrative authority grow louder. This is the paradox. Fragmentation produces desire for consolidation. Yet consolidation can suppress diversity of conscience. The spiritual core of Revelation suggests that truth does not originate from majority consensus or institutional decree, but from alignment with transcendent principles. That alignment must be internalized before external pressures test it. What does internalization look like in practice? It looks like individuals who understand why they believe what they believe. Not inherited assumptions, not reactive opposition, thoughtful conviction. It looks like communities that value integrity over access. It looks like leaders who resist exploiting fear for gain. If a future crisis, economic, ecological, technological, becomes a catalyst for restructuring, the ethical posture of those guiding the transition will determine whether parallels to Revelation deepen or diverge. Another factor often overlooked is the role of crisis fatigue. Repeated disruptions desensitize populations. After enough emergencies, extraordinary measures feel ordinary. Temporary policies become permanent infrastructure. Revelation sequences escalate progressively, perhaps reflecting cumulative fatigue. Each wave conditions humanity for the next. Imagine a scenario where financial instability triggers emergency coordination. That coordination expands digital identity requirements. A security incident justifies increased surveillance integration. A public health concern reinforces data centralization. Each step appears pragmatic. Over time, participation in economic life becomes inseparable from compliance with centralized protocols. None of this requires malicious conspiracy. It requires momentum and insufficient resistance. This is why preparation must precede crisis. Preparation means building alternative networks of trust, local economies, strong interpersonal bonds, diverse information sources, financial literacy, emotional resilience. Because when acceleration peaks, decisions will need to be made quickly, and quick decisions reveal prior alignment. Revelation does not depict its faithful as scrambling at the last moment. It portrays them as already anchored. Anchor points matter in storms. If 2026 or the surrounding period brings visible inflection, those without anchors may attach to the strongest visible structure, regardless of its ethical foundation. Those anchored internally will evaluate before aligning. Acceleration is not inherently destructive. It can catalyze renewal. Systems under pressure can reform. Corruption can be exposed. Greater transparency can emerge. But renewal requires moral clarity. Without clarity, acceleration magnifies error. The unveiling, then, may not be a singular catastrophic event. It may be a gradual exposure of what humanity values most when pressured: security over freedom, convenience over conscience, unity over truth, or truth even at cost. These are not abstract questions. They become practical under strain. As the decade unfolds, watch for the emotional tone of leadership. Is fear amplified or calmed? Are populations infantilized or empowered? Are policies debated openly or fast-tracked under urgency? These signals reveal trajectory more than dramatic imagery. The storm may not look like fire from the sky. It may look like paperwork, policy updates, software updates, and subtle shifts in language. And by the time the sky seems clear again, the landscape may have changed permanently. If the landscape can change without dramatic spectacle, then the most decisive transformations will not announce themselves with thunder. They will arrive through normalization, through updates, through agreements signed quietly, through frameworks introduced as temporary solutions that gradually solidify into permanent architecture. Revelation's power is not in predicting the aesthetic of the end, but in revealing the psychology of transition. The text describes awe, fear, admiration, confusion, devotion, resistance. It captures the emotional spectrum of a world watching power consolidate while trying to interpret what it means. One of the most underestimated forces in systemic change is narrative engineering. Not propaganda in the crude sense, but the shaping of language that defines what is considered responsible, progressive, dangerous, or outdated. Language sets boundaries for acceptable thought. Once boundaries shift, behavior follows. In a hyper-connected world, narrative can be synchronized globally within hours. International institutions, media networks, and technology platforms now operate across borders. A coordinated framing of events can shape perceptions simultaneously on multiple continents. Revelation's imagery of a world marveling together at rising power reflects this synchronized attention. Attention is power. Whoever commands attention influences interpretation, and whoever influences interpretation shapes allegiance. As we move deeper into this decade, digital platforms increasingly mediate access to information, commerce, and social validation. Algorithmic curation determines what rises to visibility. Invisible filters determine what fades. If systems evolve toward tighter moderation under the banner of safety or stability, dissenting voices may find less oxygen. This does not require overt censorship. It requires subtle deprioritization. Revelation warns not only of overt coercion, but of deception so persuasive that many embrace it willingly. Deception at scale in the modern era does not necessarily mean fabricated events. It can mean selective framing, omission, emotional priming, or reframing moral trade-offs as technical necessities. Another layer involves digital identity convergence, as financial systems, healthcare records, employment credentials, and social platforms interconnect. Identity becomes a unified profile rather than compartmentalized data. The convenience is undeniable. The vulnerability is equally undeniable. When identity is unified, access becomes conditional. The symbolic mark in Revelation may represent this convergence point, where identity, allegiance, and economic participation intersect. Whether literal or metaphorical, the principle remains: participation tied to declaration. But here is where nuance matters. Centralized systems can protect populations from fraud, streamline services, and enhance coordination during crisis. The critical variable is voluntariness and the preservation of conscience. If participation remains flexible and dissent remains protected, integration does not equate to tyranny. The danger emerges when crisis narratives justify eliminating alternatives entirely. Consider how emergencies accelerate legislation. Under urgency, debate shortens. Oversight compresses. Policies pass with broad authority. In hindsight, some prove beneficial, others prove overreaching. The difference often lies in whether sunset clauses exist and whether independent review mechanisms remain intact. Revelation portrays a period when global power appears unified and efficient. Efficiency is seductive. It reduces friction. It simplifies complexity. But efficiency can also eliminate redundancy. And redundancy is resilience. A system without redundancy is vulnerable to centralized failure. As ecological pressures continue, extreme weather variability, supply chain disruptions from climate events, agricultural unpredictability, coordination frameworks may intensify. Climate policy may integrate with financial systems through carbon tracking mechanisms. Corporations may adopt standardized digital compliance tools. Again, the architecture itself is not inherently malevolent. It is the fusion of compliance with moral allegiance that determines alignment. Another factor is generational moral recalibration. Each generation redefines what constitutes justice, fairness, and freedom. As younger leaders assume power, policy priorities shift. If moral frameworks increasingly prioritize collective security over individual liberty, structural consolidation may accelerate with public support. Revelation's depiction of widespread admiration for emerging authority suggests legitimacy in the eyes of many. Authority rarely rises through force alone. It rises through perceived competence. If global crises converge and a coordinated leadership structure successfully stabilizes markets, mitigates conflict, and restores predictability, public admiration could be immense. In that admiration lies the test, because admiration can transform into uncritical allegiance. Spiritual vigilance in such a moment does not require rejecting solutions. It requires examining the cost of those solutions. Does stability require ideological uniformity? Does access require affirmation? Does dissent become equated with sabotage? These are the fault lines. Now consider the role of artificial intelligence not just in governance, but in cultural formation. AI-generated content can shape entertainment, education, even spiritual discourse. If AI systems begin mediating moral questions or curating theological interpretation, the locus of spiritual authority subtly shifts from community to algorithm. Revelation emphasizes testimony, human witness, as central to faithfulness. Delegating moral formation entirely to systems risks spiritual passivity. Passivity is the quietest form of surrender. As we approach the latter half of the decade, the convergence of AI, digital finance, climate governance, and geopolitical restructuring creates an unprecedented integration environment. If a catalytic event accelerates synchronization, financial instability, cyber attack, military conflict. Consolidation could intensify rapidly. But here is the crucial counterbalance. Integration can also expose corruption more effectively than ever before. Whistleblowers can disseminate information instantly. Independent analysts can cross-reference data globally. Grassroots movements can mobilize digitally. Transparency and consolidation evolve simultaneously. The future is not predetermined. It is contested. Revelation's climax does not occur because systems become technologically advanced. It occurs because allegiance crystallizes, because truth and compromise can no longer coexist comfortably. If coming years pressure populations to choose between convenience and conviction, between inclusion and integrity, between security and spiritual autonomy, then the prophetic resonance will feel unmistakable. Yet even in Revelation's darkest passages, hope is interwoven. Collapse is followed by renewal. Exposure is followed by restoration. Babylon falls, but a different city descends, not built by human ambition, but grounded in justice and presence. This pattern suggests that systemic exposure, while painful, precedes purification. If 2026 becomes an inflection point, it may not signify annihilation. It may signify unveiling of corruption, of misplaced trust, of hidden fragilities. And unveiling creates opportunity for recalibration. The question is whether recalibration strengthens conscience or suppresses it. As acceleration continues, watch not only structural shifts, but your own reactions. Fear can push alignment prematurely. Anger can distort discernment. Cynicism can paralyze engagement. Steadiness is strength. If the world enters a visible restructuring phase, those who remain steady will be anchors for others, not through grand gestures, but through clarity, integrity, and refusal to surrender moral agency. Because in the end, the deepest prophecy is not about systems. It is about the human heart under pressure. If everything we have explored, acceleration, consolidation, digital convergence, economic fragility, narrative control, psychological fatigue, is building toward something, then the final question is not what happens next, but what is ultimately being revealed. Because the book of Revelation is not fundamentally about destruction. It is about disclosure. The Greek word apocalypsis means unveiling, a pulling back of the curtain, a moment when illusion collapses and reality stands exposed. The beasts, the seals, the judgments, they are not random chaos. They are the removal of masks. And the final climax is not merely the fall of a system. It is the exposure of allegiance. Throughout history, humanity has built towers, political towers, economic towers, technological towers, each promising stability, security, and significance. From ancient empires to modern digital networks, the pattern repeats: centralize power, optimize control, promise order. Revelation does not condemn innovation. It confronts idolatry. The final conflict is not between technology and spirituality. It is between worship of the system and alignment with transcendent truth. As we look toward the mid-2020s and beyond, whether 2026 becomes a visible inflection point or simply another phase of acceleration, the trajectory we observe is unmistakable. Integration is deepening. Systems are converging. Identity, finance, governance, and information are intertwining. This convergence creates unprecedented efficiency. It also creates unprecedented leverage. The climax of Revelation describes a moment when global power appears unified, admired, and seemingly invincible. Participation in the system becomes inseparable from declaration of loyalty. Economic life and ideological alignment merge. But the most striking detail is this. Many comply not out of force alone, but out of admiration and fear combined. That combination is powerful. Fear says, "You will not survive without this." Admiration says, "This is progress." Together, they silence hesitation. The ultimate climax, then, is not a meteor striking the earth. It is a decision crystallizing inside millions of individuals at once. Will security define truth? Or will truth define security? When pressure peaks, whether through economic restructuring, technological mandates, geopolitical instability, or cultural polarization, the illusion of neutrality dissolves. Silence becomes alignment. Convenience becomes declaration. And yet, Revelation does not end with tyranny. It ends with collapse, not of humanity, but of the illusion that centralized human power can replace moral authority. Babylon falls in a single hour, not necessarily because fire rains from heaven, but because systems built on exploitation and self-exaltation cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Corruption carries entropy within it. What replaces Babylon is not another empire. It is a city described not as engineered, but as descending. A symbol of order not manufactured by human control, but grounded in justice, transparency, and presence. The New Jerusalem is the counterimage to hyper-centralized technocracy. It is a system without deceit, without hidden manipulation, without coercive allegiance. Its gates are open. Its light is not artificial. Its authority is not algorithmic, whether one interprets that literally or symbolically. The message is profound. The future does not belong to the most efficient system. It belongs to the most truthful foundation. If the coming years intensify consolidation, digital identity integration, AI governance, economic restructuring, and global coordination, the real test will not be technological capability, it will be moral clarity. Because the final battle in Revelation is not fought with conventional weapons. It is fought with witness, with endurance, with refusal to surrender conscience. And here is the paradox that forms the true climax. Those who appear weakest, those who refuse compromise, who endure exclusion, who reject false worship, are portrayed as the ones who ultimately stand. Power flips. The system that seemed permanent collapses. The allegiance that seemed marginal becomes foundational. If 2026 or the surrounding years mark acceleration, unveiling, or crisis, the drama will not simply unfold in headlines. It will unfold in private decisions, in contracts signed or refused, in declarations made or withheld, in lines drawn quietly. The book of Revelation closes with a warning and an invitation. The warning: do not be intoxicated by systems that promise salvation through control. The invitation: remain aligned with truth even when truth appears costly. Because every empire in history has claimed permanence, none have achieved it. The climax of Revelation is not fear. It is restoration. Not annihilation, but renewal. Not chaos reigning forever, but deception exposed and justice established. The final unveiling is this: what humanity worships determines what humanity becomes. If we worship control, we become controlled. If we worship power, we become oppressive. If we worship convenience, we surrender freedom. But if we anchor ourselves in truth, unchanging, transcendent truth, then no consolidation, no acceleration, no digital architecture can ultimately enslave the human spirit. That is the true climax, not a date on a calendar, not a single catastrophic event, but the irreversible separation between illusion and reality. And when the curtain finally falls, it will not reveal who predicted correctly. It will reveal who remained aligned.